My name is Toby Moffett. I'm a partner at Mercury Public Affairs in Washington, D.C., a co-host of this event with Africa Practice. I'm also a former member of Congress and a former Fortune 100 vice president for a major global company. We are delighted to be involved today with this event. Mercury partners and colleagues from our offices around the country and in other parts of the world are also joining us, and we're very grateful to two of my partners, former Senator David Vitter from the state of Louisiana and former Congressman Ben Weber from the state of Minnesota. We hope this will be a different kind of conversation, a very candid one, very focused on entrepreneurs, many of them very young entrepreneurs from the US and on the African continent. We couldn't be happier at Mercury to be partnering with our friends at Africa Practice. Over the years, over many, many years that I've known the founder and leader, Marcus Courage, we've done a number of things together, and we couldn't be more impressed really with Africa Practice and their consultancy across the continent of Africa. We also have a very special guest who I'll introduce in just a moment, but I'm going to hand it over to Marcus Courage at this point. Marcus?
Thank you, Toby. Thanks for that really kind introduction. For the benefit of everyone else, this was Toby's idea and a great idea. And when he proposed it to me, I was really enthusiastic to collaborate. So as Toby mentioned, I lead the Africa Practice business with offices throughout the African continent. And some of you on this call today, we work very closely with, and I'm delighted and grateful to all of you for participating. This is a subject that's really important. How do we strengthen the US-Africa partnership and collaboration, both at the multilateral level and the bilateral level? I'm not going to preempt what I hope and know some of you are going to be saying, or Judy's introduction when I hand over to him in a moment. But I do want to thank Judy Moore from the Center for Global Development. We are privileged to have someone who is as implicated in trying to restore, if I may say, salvage the US-Africa relationship and restore it to a stature that it merits for the benefit of both parties. Someone who's directly implicated as a Liberian who served in Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's government and who now lives and works in the United States of America. So Judy, over to you to provide a little bit of context, and then Toby and Barbara are going to lead us in the first segment in a conversation. So thank you, Judy.
Thank you, Marcus, and thanks again to everyone for being here this morning. As he said, my name is Judy Moore. I am a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development, and in my previous life, I was Minister of Works of Liberia. And today, what I do mostly is do commentary and analysis on Africa's response to the presence of external actors on the continent. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the dominant external actor on the continent was the United States. That picture has changed considerably. It is not just the presence of China, it's the presence of other actors, the Gulf states, Turkey, and Russia. And because the space is so heavily contested now, I think it's important that American policy, both from the public side and but American private sector, is attuned to the changing landscape in Africa, and that the depth of the relationship between the continent and the United States remains as substantive as it's been in the past. But this relationship has had some rocky points. The last 4 years, at least the previous administration, there was significant rupture to the relationship between the continent and the United States. And the Biden administration is doing its best to restore that. But there's still much more that can be done. The value and scale of American investment on the continent also has declined, at least compared to others. But there are bright spots. I mean, almost every single African unicorn, startup unicorn, is financed by American VCs. So US companies and US money is still finding its way in the continent. How can we align American policy with the private sector to create this substantive engagement between the US and Africa? That's what we're trying to do. So here, the hope today is that this conversation will be that, a conversation that it's not a panel where we're asking people questions. This list of attendees was perfectly curated for the substantive expertise, whether on the public side or on the private side. And the hope is that out of this conversation, we can be able to have this meaningful conversation about how to move this relationship forward and how to strengthen it. Without much ado, I'll turn it back to Toby.
Thank you. Thank you. We have, as I said earlier, first of all, let me just thank our team, Avery Royster and Chris Murphy, and also the Africa Practice team for their huge amount of work in getting this this event. Bridget, June, Natalie, etc. Thank you. As I said earlier, we have a very special guest and someone who's really important to me, just as a longtime friend. I first met Congresswoman Barbara Lee when she was not a congresswoman. She was a staffer on the Hill to one of my heroes, Congressman Ron Dellums, a few years ago, Barbara. Today, flash forward, she's going to spend a small amount of time with us because she has to race away to get past a $64 billion foreign operations bill because she chairs the subcommittee, appropriations subcommittee, that has to approve every penny of foreign spending that is not DOD or Pentagon related. It's just a huge job. And we're so proud of her for having been put in this position. I might also add parenthetically, she's also chair of something that a committee that may not mean anything to most of the people on this call called Steering and Policy. But if you're a member of Congress, you need to really know Barbara Lee and you need for her to like you because she okays the appointments to every single committee for every single member of Congress. Barbara, thank you.
Thank you very much, Toby. You don't know how happy I am to be with you. And to all of those and the entire team of Africa Practice, thank you so much for inviting me, but also for the work that you're doing each and every day. Just a quick comment about my friend Toby. Yeah, he knew me when I was a staffer to our beloved Congressman Ron Dellums. And my very first visit to Africa was with the African American Institute. I don't even want to say what year, to Sierra Leone. This was in the day, I mean, like 80s, right? And so I got to know Toby as a staffer then, and our friendship has continued till today. And Toby, I just want to thank you because being in Africa with you for the first time, I think it was Bill Gray, it was Ron, I was representing Ron, it was Andy Young. It was quite a phenomenal moment for me as a young staffer. And my commitment, of course, to the continent is on many levels. As a person of African descent, I mean, you know, the ties that bind run deep with myself and with my family. And so any chance I get, and Toby, thanks again for this opportunity to meet with people who are my brothers and sisters in many respects from the continent, I really love. I'm just sorry I can't stay because I do have to, and Toby mentioned, go make sure my votes are there. And I'll just start with that. I chair we have an appropriations committee and there are 12 subcommittees, one of which is the one I chair. Never an African-American has ever chaired the subcommittee on state and foreign operations. So my budget is about 64 billion, of course, which as Toby laid out, it's development, diplomacy, of course, it's embassy security, humanitarian assistance, global health, education, climate, all of the non-defense related strategies and initiatives of the US government comes through my subcommittee. But when you look at defense, that's 800 billion now. And so I'm trying to get some of that 800 billion to put on the front end through my committee, and my colleague, Congresswoman Betty McCollum, chairs that subcommittee. So we work together to try to get some sense and make some sense into our national security strategies, which of course includes and primarily global peace and security. So we have to look at how we address development issues in a more robust way. And making that a priority, of course, is central to my work, is to strengthen the focus on regions that have been neglected. And Judy, you listed it in many ways. I don't think the US government and our country has ever been a strong partner with the continent of Africa. We've been stronger, but we've never, I don't believe, really had it as a priority. And so as mine, under my jurisdiction, I'm trying to really engage more with partnerships and economic opportunities through the funding mechanisms that we have, that I'm able to negotiate and bring forward. It's essential that the U.S. continue to invest in global health, for example, in Africa. And we're so close to turning the corner on HIV and AIDS, and we need to get there by 2030. And I led the efforts and that came out of my visits to the continent when the HIV/AIDS pandemic was enormous. So I went to President Bush and said, look, we've got to do something about AIDS in Africa. And so President Bush and myself worked to establish what we call PEPFAR, the Presidency Emergency Initiative on AIDS, and as well as the Global Fund on HIV, AIDS, and tuberculosis. That was my initiative. And we have to continue with that because these gaps are huge. The voids are great. And we've got to invest more in broad and equitable economic growth and development, and increase U.S. awareness with regard to the importance of our engagement, and generally begin to somehow make sure that our country understands that we have to have a stronger U.S.-Africa economic relationship. So Toby, I'm really glad that this really highlights why we have to get America more engaged, especially with our own businesses, small women-owned businesses and African-American-owned businesses in the United States. I've taken many trade delegations to the continent to begin to develop partnerships with their African counterparts. And oftentimes what I've found, some of the businesses really are successful, some don't, because they don't have the tools that they need. And coming from California, I come from Oakland and Berkeley, California, which is a long way from the continent. We're developing partnerships, and now in this world of Zoom and virtual kind of meetings, we hope to be able to strengthen those partnerships for investments and closer ties on development strategies with the continent of Africa and African-American owned companies and women-owned businesses. Getting to the budget this year, the Biden administration's fiscal 23 budget request, it included $7.8 billion for U.S. policy priorities in Africa, which is not enough, but it's $481 million or 7% above last year. And so we're working now to try to make sure we actually bump that up some. And we are working on this bill right now. We passed it out of committee, but it includes significant funding increases in almost every foreign assistance sector, including global health, development assistance, economic support funds, global education. And if signed into law, it would be a substantially higher amount of investment that the U.S. is making on the continent of Africa as it relates to our programs. We have jurisdiction, my committee, over USAID also. And so we're trying to make sure that I know what the priorities are, not of the continent in general, but also of the countries, each individual country. So we have a lot of work to do, both on the policy and the business front, to strengthen U.S.-Africa economic relationships. But please know that I'm going to continue to be a strong advocate and partner for our shared priorities to promote dialogue, inclusive engagement, inclusive governance, equitable growth, and opportunity across the African continent. I mean, first, it's in my DNA. So this is part of my life's work. And secondly, I think it really enhances the United States in terms of not only our national security needs. Some look at our investments on the continent as strictly from a national security standpoint, but I look at it more in terms of how we make sure that we use our resources and investments to not only make sure that there's stability on the continent, but also for global peace and security and economic development, jobs and trade and economic opportunities for people on the continent. And given the continent is a very young continent, I mean, the population of most countries is very young. And so Africa is our future. And that's where we need to focus, and the United States needs to do much better in terms of not only closing the gaps and filling some of these voids, but repairing a lot of the damage that, quite frankly, we've done on the continent and moving forward. And I think this administration, Toby knows this administration, and Secretary Blinken And those that the president has appointed have a deep commitment to making sure that this is done. So thank you all again. I'm sorry I can't, but I got to try to get these votes for this bill.
We'll let you go, but let me ask you one question. Long time ago when I was there, my sense was that the basic impulse from members of Congress on both sides of the aisle was way over on the sort of charity side when they looked at Africa, philanthropic, we'll help you out sort of thing.
Yeah.
Are we turning the corner? Is that starting to change? I mean, I do a lot of work with Senator Vitter, my partner, who's from the other side of the aisle, and we work on security, climate, supply chain, health issues, where the U.S. view is becoming, we need Africa. It's not like we're doing them some sort of favor. Are you seeing that particularly? Is there any of that on the other side of the aisle?
Yeah, it's very patronizing. And right now, I hate to say it, but on the other side of the aisle, I don't see too much in terms of a priority to invest on the continent of Africa at all. I mean, our side has to push. And I think that what we're trying to do is maintain, though, bipartisanship for certain efforts, such as the Global Fund, such as PEPFAR, such as all of the initiatives that we began in a bipartisan way. But I don't see enough focus, Toby, on anything relating to Africa. Of course, trade and investment, and there's some who don't believe in climate change, that it's not real. And so it's hard to make the argument that we've got to invest in climate resilience and solar energy and what we need to do, because they're climate deniers. And that's the truth. And so we have to tell the truth about what's taking place. But I do see members of the Congressional Black Caucus, we're 55 strong. We have a chair, Chairman Gregory Meeks, who chairs the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I've been to Africa with him many times, and he has a deep commitment to Africa. And so we're able to work with the other side on specific initiatives that benefit, hopefully, the continent, but it's not as strong, I don't believe, as it should be. And so it's the lens, finally, I'll just say, is not so much patronizing anymore as it is more of seeing the continent in the context of what America needs in terms of national security. And I'm in a lot of intelligence briefings, and I'm in a lot of these meetings where the questions are only, or the comments are only about what's in the United States national security needs through that prism. And so that's fine, but we also have to add to that a priority of what the continent of Africa requires and needs from us as a country, because like Judy said, there are actors all over the place. And so if we just see Africa as a pawn in this global war on whatever it is now, then we're into another space that I don't think is going to be beneficial to the United States nor to Africa.
Well, thank you, Barbara. And I'm so glad you got a chance to visit with one of our new rock star African ambassadors, Elsie from Tanzania, before the program started. So
yes, Elsie, I look forward, Ambassador, to meeting with you. And let me just close by saying, the Congressional Black Caucus Institute has set up an NGO at the United Nations, and I'm the representative from the Democratic caucus to each caucus. The Republican Democrats have representatives to the United Nations. One of the areas that I'm focusing on is trying to get more public awareness within the country, the United States, specifically the African-American community, about the importance of Africa, global affairs, and the United Nations. So we're working together on strengthening the presence of African-Americans at the United Nations and in all of our international UN efforts. So that's another piece, Ambassador, I'd like to talk to you and others about.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much, and good luck. Have a fruitful discussion. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Back to you, Judy.
I keep saying this. We've been doing this for like 3 years now, and you're on mute. You're on mute. I think our next speaker is Ambassador of Tanzania. No, I'm sorry. That's former Senator David Vitter. Senator.
Thanks very much. It's great to be with all of you. Thank you, Toby, my partner at Mercury, for the invitation to participate. And it's great to be with everyone in this forum. And thanks, of course, to Africa Practice for partnering with Mercury on this. I think we're going to bring in the two ambassadors, Dr. Elsie Kanza, Tanzanian ambassador to the U.S., and Martin Kamani, Kenyan ambassador to the UN, and would love to get their full-throated reaction to a lot of the comments and thoughts that Congresswoman Lee and Toby and others have laid out, particularly about the current relationship between the U.S. and African countries. So I'll just start by perhaps opening it up and asking them what are their thoughts, what is their reaction to a lot of the topics and high points that Congresswoman Lee and Toby made about the current relationship. And maybe specifically, how do you assess the U.S.-Africa relationship today, and what specifically are most needed to improve?
All right, Ambassador Kanza.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you once again for having me. It's a great privilege. And it's a topic that I'm excited about because it's something that we discuss as ambassadors, African ambassadors here in Washington, D.C., in collaboration with our colleagues from the U.S. government. So just to kick off, I'd say the current state of our relations is good. And improving day by day. Having said that, as you mentioned, Judy, we're taking off from a low base based on the traction that was lost over the past 4 years. And in that regard, it's not unusual to have feelings of mistrust continue to linger. And so there's still a need to mend and rebuild relations. In the context of Tanzania, we've been cooperating with the U.S. for the past 61 years. And so looking ahead, I say it's possible if we keep a positive trajectory to maintain a forward momentum. There was a reference to, what are the proof points for these improved relations, if someone was to ask. I said, first, the U.S. Secretary of State, Honorable Antony Blinken, visited Nigeria. He attended the ECOWAS summit in November last year. And in his speech, he mentioned two major things which stood out for me and for some of my colleagues. One is the treating Africa as equal partners. That is a general concern for all of us. And the second is not interfering with Africa's partnership with other countries, not making Africa choose. And this is a concern because we want to get away from the US or certain parties treating Africa through a patronizing lens. First of all, we're not one country, but also we have matured and continue to mature in different aspects. What's also encouraging, may somebody mute themselves if they're not speaking? Thank you. So these two promises that Secretary Blinken mentioned echoed promises which President Biden gave during the electoral campaigns, and I've had the fortune of meeting him, and he reiterated the commitment to really strengthening the relationship between the US and Africa. Second proof point is President Biden's speech to the African Union Summit in February this year. Again, he reiterated his administration's desire to rebuild the US partnership for Africa for mutual benefit. So this win-win perspective is also one that we welcome. Third, we've seen that a number of leaders have been welcomed to the White House, either to visit with President Biden or Vice President Kamala. For example, in April of this year, our President Samia Suluhu Hassan, met with the Vice President Kamala Harris, and yet she was here on official business, not a state visit. We've also seen increased efforts to revitalize the Prosper Africa initiative and announcements about new investments in the continent. That's also very compelling. Fifth is with respect to the new U.S.-Africa strategy. There's been quite a bit of outreach to the African ambassadors. I myself have been consulted individually as a member of SADC and as a member of the African Diplomatic Corps. So you can see that there are clear efforts to be as inclusive as possible in determining what the US strategy towards Africa will be. Sixth, you may have heard about the interest or intent to convene a second U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit sometime this year. We welcome this move. The downside is it's still not clear when this summit will take place, and that makes it difficult to plan towards. So we welcome the intent, and we hope that we can lock in dates and start to work on an impactful summit. Seventh, as mentioned by Congresswoman Barbara Lee, on the health side, the US has been a very strong partner in terms of the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, and has gone as far as establishing the Global Vax Initiative, which has helped many of our countries intensify their fights against COVID-19. And the eighth sort of proof point I'd like to highlight is with respect to agriculture. You may have seen the recent announcements with respect to Feed the Future program, where the US has increased target countries to 20 from 12. Now, having said that, as we look ahead, I'd like to highlight 3 areas where I see room for improvement, and particularly room for strengthening collaboration by bringing in the private sectors, both in the US and in Africa. One, again, echoing Congresswoman Barbara Lee, is with respect to economic security. As many of you are aware, trade has replaced aid as a pathway to transformation for many developing economies. And in this regard, the future of AGOA beyond 2025 is very important to us to continue to have some kind of preferential trade agreement, and particularly in the context of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. The second, again, echoing the Congresswoman, is with respect to the ongoing jobs crisis. Africa is a young continent, and too many of its youth are either unemployed or underemployed. This calls for innovative approaches to equip them with the education and entrepreneurship skills and opportunities. And here I'm particularly concerned about the fourth industrial revolution, to make sure that we are ready for the future of technology. And lastly, with respect to climate change, again, I'm echoing a point that was made, but really here I'd like to appeal for innovation. So collaboration around innovative approaches, whether with respect to insurance or just restoring economies that have been devastated. If you think about the ongoing drought in the Horn of Africa and the cost that is, the devastation that it has brought about, and the increase in food insecurity, we really need to start to develop new approaches to help all parties navigate the new normal. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Ambassador. Maybe I can bring in Ambassador Kamani, Kenyan ambassador to the US, and ask for the same sort of response and overview response to Congresswoman Lee's comments and general reaction about the US-Africa relationship and specific areas perhaps in most need of focus.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much for the invitation to join you for this meeting. I am in New York, and many of you are in Washington, and perhaps some elsewhere. But New York and Washington are nearby, but speak very different languages. And so I hope my remarks will add value to those in Washington, especially who are shaping US strategies towards Africa. I wanted to also just say in introduction that I have the privilege of observing the US relationship with different countries in the world at the time when Kenya is part of the Security Council. So I get a look in how the US is relating to different countries and different regions. And so my remarks about the US relationship with Africa are colored by my perception of the US relationship with the rest of the world, especially when it comes to security, peace and security issues. The first observation I have is that the United States, like all countries, has interests, has perceptions, and has emotional and cultural feelings about its neighbors and far-off friends and foes. At this time, I believe the US, like many other countries, is looking more within than without. It is more focused on an internal conversation. And I think this is reflected globally because it's a kind of time we live in. The citizenries in multiple countries, including the United States, including Kenya, want more to hear about the changes that are being made domestically, and sometimes believe that a focus on foreign relations is to the detriment of domestic focus. So the US is responding to its perceptions of security, its perceptions of opportunity. And in that regard, I think Africa is not high up in the list of priorities, especially at a time when there's a war going on in Europe and other crises that Washington is responding to. So it seems to me that the US focuses more on specific situations in Africa than it does on the entire African continent. So the US responds a lot more to the ecological and security crisis in the Horn of Africa than sometimes it does to other parts of Africa in terms of security. It responds to the threat of terrorism in the Sahel and in Somalia, for instance, more than it does to security interests in the southern part of Africa, for instance. I would just like to observe that the US, in my observation, is having a hard time seeing Africa as an opportunity. Congresswoman Lee certainly sees it that way, but I think overall she's in the minority. And that is not unusual. It seems US policy, when they're passionate champions, even in the minority, they can move a lot of balls in Washington towards Africa. The question is whether this time they will be able to convince the US that Africa and African countries are an opportunity. To do that, I think there's need for differentiation of what that opportunity means. The difference between a Kenya and a Nigeria and South Africa. So there's going to need to be a nuance because the commitment of the US may be more focused, may be more intense in certain areas than it is in others. For instance, the interest of Kenya to build strong infrastructure, to have a free trade agreement with the US may be very different from what a country in West Africa is seeking from the United States. So the championing of the US-Africa relationship, I think, needs to be more focused and more nuanced and more prioritized, and to respond more to the opportunity as it's shaped by Africans themselves. I think Africans are also having a difficult time on how to speak to the United States. This is not any single African mission. Certainly you've heard Ambassador Kanza here, who's a very smart and forward-facing diplomat. But how do we speak to the United States, and how do we show the United States that partnership with us is not merely a reflection of a concern about humanitarian crises or just for the advancement of democracy or many of the other issues that America considers important? How do we put what is the value add on the table in a way that benefits us? And here I have to say that a large part of that moving of this ball of this relationship has to happen on the African side of it. We have to do more, for instance, to take our African Free Trade Agreement and make it a real operating system. For that to happen, we need to build a lot more infrastructure connecting our countries. We need to make very significant changes in how Africa trades with itself. We have to make very significant changes in how we stabilize our regions. The moment we do that, the value and opportunity for the United States, this country with an economy of $25 trillion, and I think the world's leading investors, they will come knocking not because they've been told to do so as part of policy, but because they will be looking for that opportunity. So for us on our side, we need to do a lot more. And when we do that, it will not just be the US-Africa relationship that will be transformed. It's a US relationship with Europe, the US relationship with different parts of Asia and other parts of the world. So I want to say here that we have to also, as Africans, define this relationship, drive this relationship, and we have to drive it from a focus on self and a focus on how we integrate and partner with each other. It cannot be a relationship that is dependent on the perceptions of the administration presently in power or others to come or others that are fast. In fact, US policy in the last few years has stopped being the steady policy of the past. Administrations are changing quite radically in how they approach Africa and the world. So it seems to me that it's time for Africa to take greater responsibility on driving the relationship. I also want to say that in times when the United States has a sort of benign neglect towards Africa, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a negative, because it offers Africa an opportunity in the policy space and in the political space to shape its destiny more. Because US policy and the policy of other powerful countries towards Africa, even when it's not malign, sometimes the level of attention has actually detracted from Africa and African countries charting their course in a more independent way, and perhaps becoming too dependent on the powerful thrust and the powerful push from Washington. Now, when it comes to multilateral affairs, I want to say that the US-Africa relationship is going to be defined by the US relationship to the rest of the world. I sit in the UN, and when you're in the UN, you're constantly reminded of the role that the United States played in shaping that institution and the goals for that institution. And those goals were both, one, uplifting and positive, but two, also an assertion of geopolitical positioning and power. So when the United States begins to turn away from the multilateral order that it had such a primary role in building, it creates a vacuum, a dangerous vacuum, where we are unable to truly come together to solve important problems. Part of the defining of the US-Africa relationship has to be about how the US defines its relationship to the multilateral order and what it seeks to do with the multilateral order. Because the Americans who built the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, of course, they were not alone. There were other countries that were doing it with them in the 1940s. But the Americans who did that had a very particular vision of how they wanted the world to operate. The way they wanted the world to operate has changed a great deal. A great, great deal, as all of us know. The question now is, will America once again lend its vision and its power economically and politically to reforming these institutions so that they are fit for purpose for another 50 years? Or will it turn away from them, perhaps even see them as negative or useless, and leave them to benignly die a quiet, long-winded death? And when that happens, what will replace them? I want to believe that they will not be replaced by a vacuum. Rather, they will be replaced by very ambitious countries that want to more closely define a new world order, to just use that phrase. So the United States has to choose either to fight for an order that is today not fit for purpose, to neglect an order that is not fit for purpose, or to inject its vision and energy into reforming the global multilateral order in a way that allows it to remain an indispensable part of it, while uplifting those of us who need a multilateral order that responds to our needs. And these are the choices before America. And a lot of its relationship with Africa will be defined by what it does to that multilateral order. The last thing I want to say is that President Biden has sent a terrific team to New York. Congresswoman Lee spoke about her being in a UN think tank about the UN in the Congressional Black Caucus. And of course, I'm sure that the position of Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield is a very important part of the engagement with the UN. I want to say that we work very positively with Linda, and in the Security Council and bilaterally, we're working together on the crises in the Horn of Africa. We're working very well together on the regional attempt to stabilize Eastern Congo. We're even having more conversations as far away as Haiti, Colombia, and other parts of the world together. And so if that one appointment of Ambassador Greenfield was to define the overall approach to the multilateral system, then I'm sure we will have a US that is once again playing the powerful role that it can. Last point, David, an obvious point, but it's important to say that every country that has achieved escape velocity economically since the Second World War has done so by selling stuff to Americans. And this includes China. America's opening of its markets, it's making its markets available, making its investments available, has been the key to moving hundreds of millions from poverty to comfortable middle-class lives. If that road is not kept open, then many African countries are going to have to reinvent the 20th century's approach to growing wealthy and secure from that wealth. It's going to be extremely important for the United States to move beyond AGOA and embrace free trade agreements that are harder, structured in a more mutual way, rooted more in the mutual interests of the countries. And we have been trying to do that with the United States and hope to continue doing it as Kenya. A free trade that also builds on the free trade between African countries. We're also going to have to admit that fossil fuels are a critical part of the energy mix for countries and regions that suffer the kind of energy deficiencies Africa has. The United States has grown its immense and prosperous economy on the back of fossil fuels. If Africa is unable to take advantage of its fossil fuels and its resources, again, Africa is going to need an entirely new industrial revolution to actually chart its way forward to wealth and security. It's very important that the United States facilitate Africa's industrialization and development and not stand in its way. What we saw in Glasgow, with the richest countries in the world telling Africa, you will not use fossil fuels. We will continue using them, but for you, it's going to be renewables. That is not acceptable. That is not the United States that Africa needs. We need a United States that believes in trade, in business, investment, but of course, also understands that we have to respond to climate change. And the extent to which the US is able to put that at the heart of its strategy is the extent to which the US is going to be for a prosperous and secure Africa. If it does not, I fear that Africa will remain in the condition that it is in today, while its population explodes upwards and its crises become matters of global concern. Thank you, and sorry for speaking at such length.
Thank you. Very, very interesting comments, Ambassador, as were the comments of the previous speaker. Thank you so much. And now I'll turn it over to our overall moderators, who I think are going to move to a business and entrepreneurial discussion.
Yes. Richard. Yes. Unfortunately, this conversation has to end at 10 o'clock. So for the private sector, I mean, you're used to be efficient, private sector. So we'll keep the comments as pithy as possible so that we might be able to get others to participate in the conversation. But without much ado, we'll start with Charles Burrito from Google. Charles, please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Judy. It's fantastic to be here this morning, for some afternoon for myself and those on the East Coast of Africa. It's great to see all of you friends and some new faces as well. For me to unpack the relationship between US and Africa from my perspective as a business perspective, I think it's also important to anchor this on some of the changes that we've seen across the continent over the last decade. And I'm going to lean a little bit more from a technological perspective as well as human capital. Africa has made a lot of significant progress over the last decade. We see really great opportunities for technology to really transform Africa. I really like what Ambassador Kimani has just mentioned regarding charting a new revolution of industrialization. And I think that technology can really be one of that can help create opportunities and growth equitably across the continent. I would love to ground it on a couple of other data points. As you all know, 19 of the 20 fastest growing countries across the world are in Africa. 60% of the population on the continent is under 24 by 2025. Interestingly, Africa's economy is poised to grow to about $180 billion by 2025 in terms of the IGDP. That's 5.5%, almost 5.5% of the continental GDP. And driving some of this growth are some factors such as increased access to the internet. We currently see that less than half of Africa's population is actually connected, just about 40%. But over the next 5 years, we will see about 300 million more people coming online. And this creates an opportunity for the young, entrepreneurial, digitally savvy people to start looking at opportunities that can be driven by the digital economy. An expanding urban population and tech talent has really helped the continent. We anticipate that over 87% of the population growth between 2020 and 2050 is really going to be able to take advantage of the digital skills that are going to be offered. However, that comes with challenges as well, as Ambassador Kimani mentioned. Africa will be home to 1/3 of the world's youth by 2050. However, the opportunity on this is that Africa will also be home to 1/3 of the world's workforce by 2050. The ecosystem is also growing massively. We see that there's a talent of young digital entrepreneurs who are creating startups. When I look at Caitlin and Samir, who are coming right after me, they're both people who I've met with in my role as Google to see what they're doing with their startups and creating jobs across the continent. Last year alone, African startups raised over $4.1 billion in terms of investment coming into the continent. And this was over almost three times the previous year in 2020. Fintech startups are really seeing a lot of that bulk of the investments coming in. And a lot of that venture capital is also very concentrated to a number of countries: Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. We therefore really need to think through what ways do we work closely with the US to ensure that we're leveraging the relationship between African countries, African entrepreneurs, the industry, as well as the US, to ensure that we're able to accelerate the growth of digital across the continent. And I want to touch on 4 broad categories that really embark and really frame this. The first one is around physical infrastructure. We must be able to get more people connected across the continent, both from a subsea cable perspective, but also the backbone infrastructure that connects and drives data and connectivity into the continent itself. There's certain challenges we're seeing around this, and part of that is geopolitical. So the China-US challenges creates a challenge whereby American companies cannot work with American companies cannot work with Chinese companies to actually work closely together to get this connectivity into the continent at an affordable rate. We saw that with case in point is the issue around Huawei. Secondly, we see around human capital. It's really important for us to work closely with US partners, US companies, as well as the US government to help drive better skills training, skills transfer, and really also creating opportunities that cross between Africa and the US. And that will be anchored on a free flow of data as well as skills across both Africa and the US, as well as the rest of the world. Lastly, I want to touch on the element of technological innovation and adoption. We really need to see how Africa, the US, can really be at the forefront of encouraging free flow of data, digital data, cloud computing, as well as AI to really help solve for some of the biggest challenges that we see across the continent, whether it's telemedicine, adoption of technology for agriculture, or even looking at other e-government services, as Kenya has done in terms of delivering services to its consumers. I want to pause there because I know that we're short of time, but really just for the point that let's really collaborate together by driving smart policy between the different constituents around here, the different countries, leveraging the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, especially the digital protocol, so that we can be able to see the full opportunity that digital can be able to drive on the continent for all people concerned. Because at the end of the day, Africa's success over the next 20 to 50 years is going to determine the fate of the world more holistically. Thank you so much, and back to you, Judy.
Thank you. So Caitlin and Samir, what we're going to do is we'll get each of you, 4 minutes. So Caitlin, you have up to 9:30, and then Samir can do 9:30 to 9:34, and then open it up for so that we can really get comments. Over to you, Caitlin.
Perfect. Thank you, Judy. And thank you to the organizers of this event. I am also based in Nairobi, Kenya, similar to Charles. We're probably just on the road from each other, but the traffic will maybe take it hours. So I am the managing director and founder at a company called Flare, or we're known as Rescue.co in Kenya. And we started 5 years ago because we identified a massive opportunity that there was no available 911 services. And so coming from the US originally, but I have lived for the last 12 years in Kenya, focused on healthcare and focused on what will be the systems that fundamentally change the direction of healthcare on the continent. And one of those systems, of course, biased because we started a company surrounding it, is 911 services, is that, without access, with a touch of a button to help, you can't get to a hospital in time. And, there are tens of millions of preventable deaths that happen simply because you can't get the emergency help that you need. And I think that there is also a really important peace of mind component to it, is living in a city or a country without the lack of a 911 does also, impact the economic development of that country as well. So 47 out of 54 countries in Africa do not have a functioning 911 system. And, that is something that we are working to change. And I think that when I think about this conversation and where we plug into it, there's a few kind of ways. One is where we leverage the US is the US was actually one of the very first countries globally to launch 911 back in the 1960s. So we do draw upon a lot of expertise and industry knowledge such that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. That said, is kind of what Charles indicated, is the tech in the US is terrible. It's antiquated, it's based on landlines. And so when we sought out to create a system that's actually going to work in Kenya and can scale regionally and eventually across the continent, is we really needed to focus on how do we build a mobile first cloud-based system, which does not exist kind of anywhere else in the world. And so I think on that front, we are changing the game in the direction around how emergency services can be implemented and created in countries. And so I think that is the huge opportunity here, is that there is a blank slate. We don't need to unwind antiquated technology and kind of adjust on the margins, as we get to begin from today's technology and the latest kind of innovations, building the system of tomorrow. I think the kind of second piece that, from a policy side, that I think is interesting to consider is that, there continues to be a lot of investment in physical infrastructure, but digital infrastructure is just as important. And so when we think about a 911 system, it has been difficult to sell the concept sometimes, because it isn't physical, it's not a brick and mortar, it's not a hospital. And really being able to explain why it's so critical to have all of those pieces connect, and kind of what the utility of 911 is. When you have it, you never question the value, but when you don't have it, you don't really understand how that fully functions. And so I think that that's a big piece, is continuing to invest in the digital and kind of infrastructure, and not neglecting that just because it's not a physical thing that you can touch and always feel, because that can be really the launch pad for the innovation. And then I think the last piece is coming from, I used to work at the Clinton Foundation for a number of years. So I came from, the foundation NGO world, and, really started to understand where kind of government and where private sector is best placed, to kind of be able to kind of create the policies and the healthcare system of the future. I think that is certainly a place where, speaking as an American, we can do better. I think still a lot of aid money in Africa goes to, programs that when the funding ends, the program ends as well. And so thinking about the scalability and how to channel some of those resources to companies, like ourselves, such that there is continuity and there is a scalable, system that can sustain those investments, rather than doing kind of one-off, interventions, is really thinking about the longevity of like what you're building. And so I think that is a very important piece. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to answer questions or speak to anyone about it afterwards.
Thank you, Caitlin. And then we'll turn over to Samir. Samir, Caitlin took one of your minutes, so I'll add it back on. Over to you, sir.
No problem. I'll have her pay me back in Nairobi. Thank you for having me, and really, really nice to be here. So the lens through which I see a lot of our work, especially from an entrepreneurship perspective, especially in U.S.-Africa relations, is through the lens of climate. My company helps switch rural African farmers from carbon-emitting diesel fuel pumps and climate-vulnerable rainfed irrigation to solar-powered irrigation. So we ensure access to modern irrigation at a 45% discount to monthly costs of petrol and diesel irrigation. And part of why we do this is because we see that food security is national security, both locally and abroad. Food security is dependent on the stability of sort of three major components. You have food availability, food access, and food utilization. The sort of presence of all three of these components are required to establish what people call food security. And if we sort of allocate our global resources effectively, we can satisfy all three of these components, yet too much of the world kind of still lives under the threat of hunger. About 870 million people around the world are chronically undernourished. That's over 10% of the population, and 90% of these people live in Africa or Asia, which also happens to be where most of the world's population of smallholder farmers live, and it's the places in the world that are disproportionately affected by climate change. By 2050, the UN estimates that global food demand will rise by 70 to 100%, meaning that working with these folks who are under threat to produce food is important for all of us. Now, from a US perspective, the US National Intelligence Council estimates that the risk of food insecurity in many what they call countries of strategic importance, which Kenya is one of them, will increase over the next 10 years due to a host of factors, including climate pressure, population growth, which in turn leads to the spread of disease, environmental degradation, and political instability and conflict. And we've seen this all in the past 2 years. The relationship of food insecurity and political instability is a complex yet undeniable one. During the 2007-2008 food price crisis, soaring food prices triggered violent riots in 40+ countries. In the past decade, several countries have experienced regime change or armed conflict due in great part to food-related conflict. Just a few months ago, the Biden administration warned that food shortages can lead to unrest, and we're seeing that today with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what's happening in Sri Lanka and all over the world. So as a result of all of this food-related political instability, the US may face weakening strategic partners, disruption of trade routes, increasing migrant and refugee flows, and opportunities for weak and failed states to become breeding grounds for terrorism. Last July, some of you may have seen the US government's draft of the 2022 to 2026 Global Food Security Strategy. And while implementing all of these initiatives to support a food secure world is the right thing to do, it's not altruistic, it's strategic, because food security is national security. And I know most of you don't, if you're in the US, you don't browse your aisles of Whole Foods, or if you're in Nairobi through Carrefour, picking up a mango or an apple that I have here and thinking to yourself, how might the situation of smallholder farmers that produce this either in a village or halfway around the world contribute to US national security issues that I heard about on this sort of amazing webinar that Africa Practice put together. But next time you do see a sticker that says from Kenya or from Ecuador, remember that the world's smallholder farmers, most of whom live off-grid in rural areas in emerging markets, many of whom live in Africa, produce about 1/3 of the world's food and are an integral part to global food security, which means they're an integral part to your security and my security. So what we need here is more investments into improving and protecting the productivity of smallholder farmers, because that will stabilize an incredibly uncertain future. So this means very practically more equity faster, cheaper debt, and subsidies. As we know that subsidies help increase the uptake of energy and agriculture solutions, and you can use the US in the 1930s as an example. So I think the US can play a major role in as a funding partner via government, via corporates, via private companies. I think that it not only helps bolster the climate action that's needed in Africa and the resilience that's needed to sort of protect the African continent, but it protects a livable future for all of us. So I hope that this 4.5 minutes helps bridge that gap as you're thinking about how the US and Africa relate, and really start thinking about sort of the food security's role in national security around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Samir. And took that half minute, but that's okay. So I think at this point in the time that we have left, it's really important to bring in others who are on this call. Again, this list of people, the invitees, was curated for the expertise we all have, both in the public side and on the private side. And before I invite comments, the US National Intelligence Council publishes every 5 years this thing called Global Trends. And it sort of tries to say, what are the mega trends that are going to shape the future going forward? And the most recent one is 2040. And two things they highlight in there. One is demographics, right? That is definitely going to shape what happens going forward. The second is urbanization. On both counts, the future is African. How that future plays out, though, is left to us, and the conversation as between the public and the private side. The median age in Japan is what, 48? The median age in Nigeria is 18. It means that by 2080, most of the people in Nigeria today would be alive. The future is evidently going in that direction. Today, we're going to go from 2 of the largest metropolitan areas in the world, of the top 20, to 13 in Africa. Cities are what drive consumption. So again, Africa is leading on that. How can we make that future possible, though? So on the one hand, we have the public side. On the other hand, we have the private side. So we'll open it up now to comments for people on here, really, really knowledgeable people, to respond to something you heard, either from the politicians, the policymakers, or from the private sector side. And with that, just raise your hand using the little thingy there, and or you can literally raise your hand, and if I see you, I'll call you.
David's put a question.
David, you want to ask? You want to ask that question openly? Can we unmute David?
Yeah. Thanks, Gide. Yeah, so Macky Sall, in his inauguration speech at the African Union in January, talked a lot about Africa's access to capital markets and the increased costs of borrowing, which is in part shaped by the way that the credit rating agencies consider African risk. And we know that the majority of African sovereign debt is denominated in US dollars, leaving them vulnerable to increases in interest rates at the Fed and all the risks that you're seeing in relation to debt vulnerability. So is there anything structural that the US could do about that? Because it strikes me as that could be a transformative thing in terms of reducing the cost of capital and therefore unlocking billions, potentially trillions for all the infrastructure needs that we've talked about.
And please, anyone can respond to that. I think that's a fair question. I think on the private side, everything we've heard here is talking about continued increase to capital and cheap capital that allows this to happen. So anyone want to, Leslie?
Thanks, Jude. I'm Leslie Marbury. I'm heading up the Prosper Africa Initiative, which is a U.S. government initiative to increase trade and investment between the U.S. and Africa. And I just wanted to respond to David's point and say this is definitely an area where we are focused and doubling down. We hear from our African partners a lot that what they're interested in is access to long-term capital. And we are looking at how to engage a lot of asset managers and large investors in the US and bring them into the continent to decrease their perceptions of risk. I'm going next week to the continent, actually to North Africa, but to the CCA U.S.-Africa Business Summit with a group of investors, and we are digging into this topic in great detail. We see that there is importance of engaging the investors, but also to address some of these structural issues that you're mentioning. And actually we have a call for proposals out right now looking for partners to work on this, including the credit rating. So would love to engage with you more on this topic, and let's follow up.
Thank you, Leslie. While we're doing this, I just wanted to pose a question based on something that Charles said about the difficulty of U.S. private sector firms working with their Chinese counterparts in Africa, but in instances where collaboration actually makes sense. Would it then, could it be then that, African policymakers and African businesses could ask for a truce when it comes to African infrastructure so that there's this carve out that allows a certain amount of cooperation between American and Chinese firms when it comes to the African market, especially in places where it's not overtly competitive? I don't know if it's something that's amenable to the US policymakers, but I think from the African side, it would make sense that in places where the US has unique competencies and the Chinese firms there might be a way for them to work in Africa. So we want some sort of like a carve out. I would just like to hear feedback on
Judy, this is Toby. I think number one would be climate. There needs to be collaboration, as we know, all over the globe. But if today in the New York Times, massive article about the Congo Basin and DRC and just, pure disaster. That's the kind of thing where whoever decides to reach out, or maybe they do it at once, the US and China should really have focus on things like that, seems to me.
So, Charles, is there room for that in tech?
I think so. I think one of the key challenges that I hear from my policy counterparts is saying that at the end of the day, they need to build the infrastructure at the most cost-effective price for the country. So if Huawei, for instance, is giving certain infrastructure 10-20% of what Oracle or Cisco or another Western companies providing the same or the similar type of infrastructure, the country cannot afford to actually go with that. And I would love to hear some of the ambassadors' positions on that, because I deal quite a bit with the ministers of ICTs and some of the other ministers who are around infrastructure investments. But those are some of the challenges. So for instance, with the Huawei sort of situation, people still had to go ahead and do that. And I know that I've spoken to a couple of people on this call in separate conversations. But for instance, when Google could not work with Huawei, Huawei went ahead and started creating their own OS system, which at the end of the day, they do have a distribution network across the continents. They will continue selling their devices and figure out a way of getting into the market, which then actually doesn't pose more broadly well for the US because Android is currently a really successful operating system on mobile phones. So I think we need to also ensure that we are, as US policy is happening in DC, it is also cognizant of the local nuances happening on the continent.
Marcus and Bridget, at your convenience, you can show us what the poll said. But I think I would like to bring in any of the African ambassadors here on this question of, when you engage with your US counterparts here in Washington, is this a point that you make that, look, there are certain areas, certain things that we need where it makes sense for us to have as many partners as possible. And maybe in this case, it might mean working with China. Is this something that comes up in your conversations with your American counterparts?
Interestingly, Judy, on a different collaborative note, I saw an announcement just in the last few days, a collaboration between Tokyo and the City of London, specifically for financing in Africa, financing of project financing, which I thought was an interesting initiative. I think it's been under development for some time.
It seems like I think the investment in infrastructure, both of the different, I mean, physical infrastructure, but also the digital infrastructure. I think a lot of people are thinking about that. I wanted to, again, invite comments on the second point that Charles made. Charles, I think the Google and IFC did a sort of an evaluation of the digital economy in Africa, and they found that there are about 700,000 software engineers and coders on the continent. About a third of them are self-taught. And so this question of human capital and how to train the workforce, especially for the digital economy. The thing though is there's a story this morning that the fastest man in Africa, a Kenyan runner, who is now the fastest man in Africa, is not going to be able to compete in the US because of visa issues, right? So getting Africans, into US universities for training on any scale, I can't imagine how that's going to happen. So how else? Oh, apparently he made it, so thank God. But how else are we going to train the workforce for the digital economy because of the prospect of what that could be? Where are the points of collaborating between the US private sector, US universities, and training Africans? Anyone wants to address that question of the human capital piece? We're open to it.
Charles, I think you're being shy and concerned about hogging the limelight, but I know you've got a lot of data on this and that the opportunity is immense. You talked about the scale of the IGTP contribution, which $180 billion. And I think when we spoke last, you told me about how much of the coding and software development community within Africa that Judy just referenced is actually working for a global market, and much of that market is in America. And I think that that's exciting.
Absolutely, and Marcus, you're right. I don't want to be hogging the call, but I think there's a fantastic opportunity for the US government, US companies, and African nations to really collaborate closely to leverage that. One of the data points I made, that by 2050, we're going to see more than a third of the world's workforce right here on the continent. So the point I made around connectivity becomes very critical. The research that Jody mentioned, 38%, the other element is that 38% of the 720,000 developers on the continent are actually working for companies outside Africa. What that does is that it creates an opportunity for virtual jobs and inflows of revenue to actually come to the continent. And it's really that notion of ensuring that we're creating opportunities right here, because a developer or someone who's employed doing virtual work on the continent actually is a lot more valuable to the country and to their community than someone who travels abroad and works there, because things such as if they're renting a house, they need to buy food. They build a whole ecosystem around their lives right here on the continent. So as we're thinking about 2050 and the future of work, the ability to ensure that we have things such as cross-border data flows, which allows jobs to be done virtually, free flow of data from one country to the next and from one continent to the next, ensuring that we have progressive data privacy laws that encourage that job creation and people to work virtually is really going to anchor and help accelerate economic growth and job opportunities across the continent. Just recently in Ghana, Google partnered with Mercury to open up a service center in Accra. And what that does is that it's employing hundreds of Ghanaians who are going to work in Ghana, in Accra. But the critical piece is ensuring that you have the right policies to be able to actually do those jobs from Accra and create those jobs. Philippines, as well as India, have done a phenomenal job to create those. And these are really high value jobs as well. So it's important to think how African countries, as well as the US government in partnership, can really encourage that free flow of skill sets and opportunities around human capital.
You know, and on that note, is, you know, again, this is about, you know, improving the depth and of U.S.-Africa engagement. But I think the U.S. policymakers can also look to see what their adversaries are doing. The Carnegie Endowment, you just recently released a report about Chinese tech in Indonesia, and it's weird because Indonesian sentiment toward China has worsened. Right? Indonesians have become more distrustful of China. However, Chinese tech has conquered Indonesia. And the reason is because they provide a significant amount of training. But the training is done in such a way that they train Indonesians how to use it, but China builds the tech. And we're seeing a similar thing happen now in Angola, where they're building it's like a $10 million facility to train people. And I think US firms like your company, Charles, Google, like the Facebook, Meta, Netflix, that are now beginning to making inroads on the continent, they too can participate in these kinds of trainings so that we can build that workforce that will be able to you know, participate and create the kinds of jobs that we're looking for. Again, I definitely, I mean, there's a lot of people on this call, a lot of knowledgeable people. You know, I started off by saying that the relationship between the US and the continent suffered a bit in the last 4 years. We know that, at least now from Mark Esper, that there was a point where the former president actually threatened to close every US embassy on the continent. And the only reason he backed away from that was because he was told it would benefit China. We also know that almost every budget submission recommended deep cuts to programs that you know, benefit Africa. It was in Congress that those cuts were sort of pared back. So I don't know, and I would like to hear in the 4 minutes we have left, if the ambassadors would like to say something, if people who interface with the US government will say something, that beyond the fact that the new administration isn't the Trump administration, have we seen substantive changes? Or is the new administration simply happy with not being the Trump administration in terms of the relationship between them and the African continent? Do we see a substantive difference? Can we recommend places where those changes can be made? I think Toby's point about collaborating on climate is one. Collaborating on global public health should definitely be a second one. But please, ambassadors, business people on here, have you seen a significant substantive change, not just rhetoric and posture, but substantive change in how the US is now dealing with the African partners? Well, so I will just come to you then, David, because you follow this in especially from the debt side. But the US is such a big player in multilateral institutions. Do we see, and under the previous administration, there was almost an assault on multilateral institutions from the US. Do we see a substantive change, and is that change beneficial to Africa? Or again, like I said, is the Biden administration simply happy to not be the Trump administration? David.
Thanks, Judy. I mean, I think we've certainly seen a change of rhetoric. I mean, what Janet Yellen has done on the special drawing rights and the speech that she made at the Atlantic Council in April, I think is quite significant. But we're also seeing a lack of kind of follow through, in part, due to congressional issues. So the commitment that was made to recycle the US portion of special drawing rights has not been delivered a year after the commitment was made, and the commitment was meant to be an emergency response to the economic effects of COVID. So I think that undermines credibility. But I think there's a lot more that could be done, particularly on, maximizing the role of the World Bank and how it uses its AAA credit rating to access finance on capital markets. I think the announcement that was made at the G7 on infrastructure finance, whilst the kind of tone is right, I think there's a lot of skepticism around what's actually on the table. GD, one of your colleagues, Charles Kennedy, did an analysis of the actual money that was on the table as part of that 200 billion commitment, and I think he said it was enough to purchase 2 escalators on the New York subway. And if that's basically the challenge to the BRI, that's not very credible. So I think there's more that needs to be done in terms of like putting actual resources on the table.
Thank you. At this point, I mean, again, just thanks to everyone who participated on the call. I'd like to turn over to Toby now, even though you were, slightly less talkative than I would have hoped. But again, just your presence here today is just marks how important this conversation is, and the hope is that we can continue to have these kinds of engagements. Toby, over to you.
Yes, well, thanks, Judy, and thanks to everyone who participated. I mean, I think we do have, and this is not really a partisan statement, I think it's a fact, we do have an administration that's listening and trying. You mentioned immigration and I think it was the Kenyan runner had problems. We do a lot of work in immigration, and just cleaning up the mess from the last administration, has taken the better part of 2 years. But we're starting to see real changes in terms of an exchange and Africans being able to come this way and Americans the other way. We'd like to get your reaction in the days ahead to this event, where Marcus and Africa Practice and Mercury and I, Senator Vitter and Congressman Weber and our team would love to hear what you thought about it, and whether you think we, as a group, everybody on this call, should reconvene at some point, and how we could do that in an even more effective way. So, and there will be a recording that will be shared. We're also going to be talking to our friends at the Corporate Council with regard to their summit in Morocco next week, and letting them know, the basics of what transpired here. Marcus, you want to close it off?
I think I don't want to keep everyone, but thank you everyone for your participation. And we will, as Toby said, be making sure that we've got both a recording and a short transcript to share with you.
Thank you all. Have a good day.